Recording. Brilliant, thank you. I should actually say that, yeah, we're recording the talk, but only the actual talk will be put onto YouTube. Any sort of the questions afterwards, we do remove from the recording, so we won't include that area. So today we've got Sasha Gora. She's a cultural historian and writer with a focus on food history, contemporary art, and the environmental humanities. She holds a PhD from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich and has been a visiting scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, a postdoctoral research fellow at Ca' Fosca University of Venice, and a lecturer at the Rachel Carson Center in Munich. She's currently a resident at Delphine Foundation in London as part of its Politics of Food programme, and is about to join the Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities as an international fellow. Her writing has been featured by publications such as Gastronomica, Sea Magazine, Arts of the Working Class, Vice, the Preserve Journal, and Eton. So today, Sasha is going to talk to us about a cuisine of its own, culinary sorry, I knew I'd get this wrong because there's lots of C's. Culinary colonialism in Canada. Got there in the end. So over to you, Sasha.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Matt, for that introduction. Are you able to hear me okay and see the presentation?
Yes,
okay.
It's fine. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So yes, thank you, Matt, for the introduction. And also thanks to Kelly and to Charlie. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to share my research today and to be part of the food history seminar. I also want to thank everyone for coming. It's so nice to see so many people in the audience and some familiar names and faces. So today my presentation departs from the question, what is Canadian cuisine and how does it differ from Indigenous fare? So early settlers in the lands now known as Canada were initially dependent on Indigenous foodways, only to replace them with European flora and fauna. But later, when the country chiseled out an identity of its own, Canadian visual imagery drew from and reimagined Indigenous motifs. So today I'm going to be zooming in on examples of this, including the feast that Canada threw for its centennial in 1967, and how the country claimed Indigenous ingredients as Canadian. In response, I will then spotlight contemporary Indigenous chefs who are cooking back and reclaiming ingredients. So to study food is to study how it is rooted in or transcends a particular place. It is to study land and how land is worked and transformed, imagined and represented, bought, sold, won and lost, whom it belongs to and who belongs to it. In Canada, to talk about food is to talk about land, power, colonial erasure, and now also Indigenous resurgence. So food enacts relationships. And to quote the Anishinaabe activist, Winona LaDuke, food for us comes from our relatives, whether they have wings or fins or roots. She explains, quote, that is how we consider food. Food has a culture, it has a history, it has a story, it has relationships, end quote. So I'm going to be focusing a little bit on these relationships. So food also enacts power. And the literary scholar Marjorie Fee asks, how does literature claim land? And in dialogue with this, I ask, how does food claim land? So what I'm presenting today draws from my doctoral research and also my forthcoming book titled Culinary Claims. And it's really important for me to acknowledge that I am a fourth generation settler from Toronto. And this is a word that comes from the Mohawk, Takaranto, and it is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Positionality, so the acknowledgement of this, writes Cree Métis scholar Deanne Rader, emphasizes, quote, that all knowledge is generated from particular positions, that there is no unbiased neutral position possible, end quote. So by locating myself in relation to my research, I recognize the place-based responsibilities I have inherited as a guest on the lands where I was born and raised. And ironically, I'm actually giving this talk today from London, and part of this positioning is also what I'm going to be talking about in terms of thinking about the construction of a Canadian culinary identity. So culturally, land can be claimed and reclaimed through food. Any plate that serves plants or animals by default also serves land, I argue. And Michael Twitty writes that, quote, "There is no chef without a homeland. Your plate is your flag." So food is a testimony to a chef's and to a culture's relationship to and with land. So thinking about this in Canada, food has been and very much continues to be a tool of colonial control, but it is also a form of resistance. Since the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 2015 report on the history of Indian residential schools, the Canadian government has been beginning to confront what the report terms cultural genocide. 2017 marked 150 years since Canadian Confederation. And then 2 years later, in 2019, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls released its report, which further pressed the urgency of reconciliation. So Canada is in the so-called reconciliation era. But then in May 2021, so last year, a headline announced, quote, "Canada, remains of 215 children found at Indigenous residential school site." So this was one of, unfortunately, many headlines from last year. And this one was from Kamloops Indian School in British Columbia. It also confirmed what survivors and reports had been saying for decades. The discovery of these unmarked graves is an ongoing reminder of the horrific consequences of ongoing genocide. And food, too, has played a part in this. So as the word gives away, agriculture is culture. It is the process of selecting plants that transforms them into food. And Frida Knobloch argues that, quote, "colonization is an agricultural act." The word colony comes from the Latin colonus, which means farmer. So in Canada, colonization through food has worked in two ways. The first was to remove existing Indigenous food sources, such as land and animals like the bison, which was in the first slide, and I'll come back to that in my conclusion. And the second is what you see in this image, which was to replace them with European systems that, in addition to producing edible commodities, also produce new symbolic values. So at the same time, Canada was looking with images with which to construct its own identity. And the use of Indigenous imagery to sell Canada begins with a railroad, two oceans, and the dream to transform the land in between into one nation. In 1871, British Columbia became Canada's sixth province. 4 years after Confederation, the Dominion of Canada courted BC by promising to build a railway to the Pacific. And the government hurried efforts to abolish Indigenous title to land. Construction commenced in 1881, and the railway's last spike was driven in 1885. And by then, the vast majority of Indigenous peoples were on reserves. Historian James Dashwood writes, quote, "To the hungry Indigenous population, this meant that officials quickly turned the food crisis into a means to control them, to facilitate construction of the railway and the opening of the country to agrarian settlement." So the Swampy Cree researcher Tabitha Robin also refers to this as the Hunger Project. So the Canadian Pacific Railway did not connect a nation, it very much created one. But the role of Indigenous peoples in this nation was up for debate. So accompanying the tracks, the Canadian Pacific Railway built a series of hotels designed to mimic European chateaus. Examples include Quebec City's Chateau Frontenac, constructed in 1893, the Banff Springs Hotel from 1888, and Victoria is the Empress. So the names kind of illustrate what the architecture was trying to achieve. And the CPR also provided options for not just room, but board. So from train station lunch counters and onboard restaurant wagons to hotel dining rooms. And the menu's visuals very much are shorthand for how Canada was positioning itself at the time. So the CPR designed menus that told stories about the land it conquered, crossed, and connected. So this is an example of one of these menus, most likely from the 1940s. So here you see both the front of the menu and also the back cover. So referring to the 1880s, the back states, before the Canadian Pacific, this is how the plains looked. Wild. Quote, building the railroad across this unsettled, unproductive continent was the supreme test of the growing nation's courage, its vision, and its resources. So as you can see, this is a hyperbolic flag waving text. It exclaims, think of Canada without Vancouver, without transportation. Canada's boundless acres had no value. Continuing and wrapping up with, quote, the Canadian Pacific laid the foundation of Canada's greatness. So at no point in the menu is kind of the cover image addressed. Instead, the image is utilized to represent a before that was unsettled and unproductive, and the CPR takes credit for the after. So these are the dishes that the menu includes. So pretty standard, the likes of omelets, chicken, and roast beef, but some descriptions signify geographical provenance. So for example, there's Okanagan celery and Lake Superior trout. But despite the attempt to affix particular dishes to the lands of Canada, there is still a disconnect between the cover and the food in this instance. But what's important here is also how the menu belongs to a historic moment in which Canada was trying to craft a separate identity from Britain and look for visual inspiration among Indigenous communities it was actively trying to assimilate and destroy. So it also exemplifies a tendency that Patrick Wolfe has identified. Quote, on the one hand, settler society required the practical elimination of the natives in order to establish itself on their territory. On the symbolic level, however, settler society subsequently sought to recuperate indigeneity in order to express its differences and independence from the mother country, end quote. So this is an example of another menu from 1959. So it's a breakfast menu. And here we're moving from painting to photography. And the top image captures men on horseback and the bottom, a Rocky Mountain landscape. So the back of this menu, once again, provides further information, kind of a narrative to analyze. And here it says, every summer at Banff, tribal sports and contests are held during a 4-day period known as Indian Days. So these took place annually from 1907 to 1976, but there were also earlier editions starting in 1889. And this was essentially the Canadian equivalent of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. So Indigenous studies scholar Courtney Mason argues the festival's visuals contributed to a discourse that, quote, supported pre-colonial images that exoticized and temporalized local Indigenous cultures. So the menu is going in the same direction in the sense that it's representing Indigenous peoples, but in a manner that still restricts them to the past as opposed to the present. So moving to another example, now we're in 1967, so Canada's centennial. But what is starting to change a little bit more here is in addition to just using Indigenous visuals, food is having more and more of a place in terms of this construction of a Canadian identity. So in 1962, the Bureau des Expositions selected Montreal as the host of the International and Universal Exposition, and 1 year later, the theme, Man and His World. So running from April to October 1967 and attracting more than 50 million visitors, Expo 67 was concerned with proving that Canada had matured into a cohesive and civilized nation. So very much the country that the CPR menus had rallied for. So at Expo 67, there were 73 restaurants, 76 snack bars, and 46 food shops. So food was a big event here. And La Tundra was one of 2 restaurants representing the host nation. And its menu is divided into 3 sections: Cuisine Canadien, La Tundra, and both of these names are in French, and then International Cuisine. So here's an example of the Cuisine Canadien page. So the menu is bilingual and French appears first and then English. However, Expo 67 actually predates Canada's 1969 Official Language Act. So thinking about this is perhaps to reflect Montreal's majority language, but could also be seen as aligning and therefore potentially elevating Canadian fare with the cuisine of France. So each part of the menu has a similar structure, but the names differ. The Cuisine Canadien and La Tundra categories read like prose. So moving to La Tundra. So names like nibbles and morsels, steaming crocs, party fairs, and dainty and piquant for Cuisine Canadien. And then as you see here, from icy streams and lakes, bubbling kettles, sustaining and fortifying, and Katamavac treats for La Tundra. So International Cuisine, I won't show you an image of it because it's not as interesting as these 2 pages, employs names that are kind of boring or more standard in comparison. So savory appetizer, entree, dessert. And what's important to note here is that the less common dishes, including beaver tail broth, are listed under La Tundra. So as you also see, short descriptions introduce the mains, so the dishes that are here. And some are rather obvious, but others matter-of-factly present foods like this beluga whale casserole. So the hearty flavor of beluga whale meat prepared in the fashion of today. So from the menu, it's not clear what the fashion of today is and how it compares to previous ones. Either way, whale is far from a popular protein in Canada. But actually, La Tundra's maitre d' had hoped otherwise, having said, quote, "No new discovery has emerged in the food world since the development of the Cornish hen. With the introduction of the Arctic whale, Canada may create a culinary revolution at Expo." So I'll come back to whale later in the presentation. The organizers had commissioned 2 Inuit artists, Elijah Pudlat and Kukumalpik Sakyag, to create site-specific wall murals depicting everyday life in the North. And the program further describes the decor. So seats upholstered in sealskin and carpeting pattern and woven to resemble lichen adds to the glamour, it writes. Rona Richmond-Keneally, who has done a close reading of this menu as well, suggests one would assume a restaurant in a national pavilion would serve what is commonly found in a country's eateries and kitchens. But as she states, La Tundra would have been an unfamiliar environment for the majority of its Canadian patrons, these particular dishes. So the full page ad in the Expo program ends with La Tundra, unforgettable. And this has proven to be true, as Expo 67 was very much a hive of activity where Canadians sought to represent their nation to the world. It branded Canada a modern northern country, simultaneously civilized and full of wilderness, something that this menu depicts. So it's a similar story to the Canadian Pacific Railway and its menus. So La Tundra celebrated a romanticized idea of the North at the same time that the Canadian government was forcefully changing it to resemble the South. And so having moved from visuals to both visuals and edibles, Expo 67 imagined a plentiful assortment of Indigenous ingredients that it was claiming now belonged to the National Canadian Pantry. So 50 years later, 2017, this is a map that the CBC published. So this was 2 years after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded, 21 years after the last residential school closed, and 150 years after Canadian Confederation. So this article states, quote, "Wander down Restaurant Row in any of Canada's major cities, and you'll see a culinary mosaic of international offerings. But there's a culture that's been notably absent until now." So this text emphasizes the last words, "until now," and then describes, quote, "a new surge of Indigenous restaurants, which many note is long overdue." So the pandemic has shifted this a little bit, but there were around 8,000 restaurants in Toronto. Until 2016, there was only one Indigenous restaurant, 3 more opened. Now there is once again only one. But actually, starting in the 1970s, so thinking about after Expo 67, Indigenous chefs began to claim and reclaim dishes and ingredients. So in 1971, which is the same year that Alice Waters opened Chez Panisse in Berkeley, California, the Mukkamuk opened in Vancouver at 1724 Davie Street. In fact, the early history of Indigenous restaurants centers on this one address, which housed 3 different ones. So the Mukkamuk, the Quillicum, and the Lillooet Feast House. So I'm just going to mention a couple of names here. But unlike the Quillicum and the Lillooet Feast House, the Mukkamuk was not Indigenous owned. However, as you see from the menu here, it marketed itself as serving Northwest Coast Native Indian food and hired Indigenous staff. And the restaurant was quite popular. Andy Warhol dined there, and the New York Times recommended it in 1977. So 1 year later, the restaurant temporarily closed because of labor problems. It later reopened, but employees had joined a socialist feminist union, which launched a strike that lasted a total of 3 years. So as one explained, racial issues emerged when employees realized that the owners were, quote, "getting rich off Native culture." The Mukkamuk closed in 1981, and some of its employees reopened the space as the Quillicum in 1985. So a Chinook jargon word, Quillicum, means return of the people, which doubled as a metaphor. So earlier restaurants rallied for cultural recognition, and then more recent ones are rallying for Indigenous political resurgence. So an example of this is Nishtish, which unfortunately closed during the pandemic. But Joel White Duck Ringat, the restaurateur, has plans to reopen it at another point. But it first opened in Toronto in 2017. And its motto was "Your friendly neighbor since always." So to read an Indigenous restaurant's menu is to read how it culturally negotiates a settler-dominated city. Restaurant signs, menus, and dishes are means with which a culture gains presence. So restaurants validate or challenge culinary and cultural norms. So moving to an example outside of restaurants, Top Chef Canada contestants dress in classic chef whites. A patch of red peeks out from the sleeve, as you can see here, the Canadian maple leaf. But on season 4, Rich Francis stitched the Haudenosaunee flag onto his uniform. It represents the Hiawatha Wampum belt. A tree symbolizing peace stands in its center. In 2011, Francis became Top Chef Canada's first Indigenous contestant. How could a Canadian show have zero representation of Indigenous foods or chefs, he asked, only to answer himself. But then again, why would it be different? Our food is relatively unknown. Francis took advantage of this exposure to promote Indigenous cuisine. And although he was a Top Chef Canada contestant and placed 3rd, he made it clear he was not representing Canada. So he's the owner of the Seventh Fire Hospitality Group, a catering company, and describes his cooking as, quote, "a candid journey toward truth and reconciliation, using Indigenous foods to create a better understanding of pre-colonial Indigenous cultures and the impact of colonization." He largely works with pre-contact ingredients, reclaiming them. From Fort McPherson in the Northwest Territories, his mother is Haudenosaunee and his father Gwich'in, and he's based on the 6 nations of the Grand River. He graduated from the Stratford Chef School, worked in fine dining, and since Top Chef has been traveling across Canada, hosting dinners, participating in events, and teaching. he's also been learning. Because to cook traditional ingredients requires relearning. He leads workshops with urban First Nation students, many of whom, he says, have not tried traditional foods. He says, quote, "I cook a lot with medicines as flavor carriers. They identify with something, but they don't know what it is. I see it and I think that it is our food DNA. That's the power that food has," he explains. So food DNA then relates to food memory. And memory, according to Catherine Wright, who is an environmental humanities scholar, writing about Australia in this case, is, quote, "at the heart of decolonization, because the perceived legitimacy of a settler colonial occupation of land and the denial of Aboriginal sovereignty depends on silence and amnesia. Because of this, as Cherokee political scientist Jeff Corntassel sums up, within a colonial context, acts of remembrance are resurgence." So Francis's signature dish is salmon with the floor flavors of the medicine wheel, which he sometimes calls medicine wheel salmon. So this is salmon cured with sage, tobacco, sweetgrass, and cedar. The dish that serves as his culinary calling card. And this connection with medicine matters. He explains, "I just can't throw a piece of salmon on a plate with a bunch of other stuff and call it indigenous food. There is no significance there. It doesn't tell a story." Without referencing the medicine wheel, sage, tobacco, sweetgrass, and cedar are simply flavors, a cluster of seasonings to pick up salmon. And the name of Francis's cured salmon is a reminder of food's potential to heal. And this recalls Robin Wall Kimmerer's 2013 book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. So she's a Potawatomi ethnobotanist. And although she writes about many plants, her words about sweetgrass connect very closely to Francis's concept of cooking for reconciliation. So sweetgrass reminded Kimmerer that, quote, "it is not the land that has been broken, but our relationship to it." And this is similar to what farmer and activist Leah Penniman writes about contemporary Black agrarianism in the United States. Quote, "while the land was the scene of the crime, she was never the criminal." To restore land, one must restore relationships to it. And one way begins with recognizing land as sustainer, land as identity, land as connection to ancestors, moral obligation, sacred, and self, as Kimmerer writes. So Francis's medicine wheel salmon seeks to not only eat from the land, but to reconnect it to it by acknowledging food as its expression, perhaps maybe even its breath. In 2017, East Coast Living, from which you see an image here, published a recipe for medicine wheel salmon. It calls for brown sugar, salt, juniper berries, fresh thyme, a cinnamon stick, 3 inches of braided sweetgrass, pepper, red beet, and buffalo or white sage. You blend the seasonings, remove the skin, press the mixture onto the fillets, and then leave it to cure for 4 to 12 hours. So this is a recipe adapted for the home cook, and cedar and tobacco are missing. They're not common ingredients, but they are legal ingredients. But there are also ingredients that Francis is not allowed to serve. So in November 2017, he posted an image on Facebook of muktuk, of whale blubber, which returns to La Tundra because it was a dish that it had served in 1967. So Francis wrote, quote, "I'm exhausted, angry, and frustrated from being told what I can and can't serve on my menus. In 2017, nothing has changed in over 150 years of colonialism and cultural genocide. I still have to hide to serve moose meat, muktuk, sea lion, among other things. I face lengthy jail sentences and huge fines, $70,000 if I get caught. Am I a criminal for doing this? It's infuriating that still today I have to go in isolation privately or pull back from what was original to accommodate to the rules and regulations of the Canadian government. Food as a weapon is very real. If you control the food, you control the people." So he's posted the same content again, a reminder that these same rules still apply. One point he added a picture of a moose heart and ribs and alerted his followers that despite repeatedly being booked for large events, he had been told he couldn't serve traditional Indigenous foods. So these constraints also influence where Francis cooks and also show some of the limits of restaurants. So although he has supported the idea of opening a restaurant, he has decided to prioritize other projects. So if you want to try medicine wheel salmon, you have to sign up for one of his events or track down tobacco and cedar, sweetgrass and sage, and make it at home. So I spoke to Francis when he was still at one point planning to open a restaurant. And he told me up until this point, quote, "We were told what we could and could not serve in our restaurant. If we are going to reconcile, let's do it properly. If my time in court comes, I hope it will be a restaurant that will lead by example. I cannot dull down my vision to accommodate the rules and regulations," he insists. So restaurant or not, Francis demonstrates the potential of food for surfacing difficult conversations, as well as the contemporary limits of restaurants as a means of reconciliation. But food is very much connected to reconciliation. And so to conclude, I want to return to the image that I started with. For the 2019 Toronto Biennial, artists Adrian Stimpson and A.A. Bronson collaborated on an installation. Stimpson, a member of the Siksika, is the great-grandson of Chief Oldson. Bronson is the great-grandson of Anglican missionary and founder of the Oldson Residential School in Siksika Nation, John Williams Timms. The two were on opposing sides in the 1895 Siksika Rebellion, a conflict sparked by food allowance cuts. Bronson's great-grandfather fled, but his son, the artist's grandfather, later ran another residential school. For the biennial, Bronson created the multimedia project, A Public Apology to Siksika Nation, consisting of a performance as well as a publication, photographs, and boxes of his apology. The installation centerpiece is Stimpson's Iniki Sokampai, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. A bronze sculpture on each plate is a reminder of how the decimation of the bison forced the Siksika onto reservations. So here the table is set for a conversation between Bronson and the Siksika for Bronson's apology. The installation advocates for the need for personal conversations, ones that tables host. So the table is a place to negotiate, to represent, to remember. Eating is a form of building community, of sharing and exchange. Food builds relationships with what you eat and whom you eat it with. It therefore plays a central role in efforts made by Indigenous communities across Turtle Island and the world to reclaim languages, traditions, and culture, but also land. And as the work of Rich Francis demonstrates, contemporary Indigenous chefs use food to reclaim culture and a connection to their lands. So to return to the question that I started with at the beginning, in many instances, Indigenous chefs may actually be serving similar dishes as farm-to-table Canadian ones, but they serve different stories. Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Sasha.